sponsored by the Union Mills Homestead Foundation. And I guess I might not have been muted to start. Welcome to the program tonight. This is sponsored by the Union Mills Homestead Foundation and the Carroll County Public Library, and in partnership with the Celebrating America initiative. Our thanks to the Carroll County Public Library, which is broadcasting the program this evening. I'm Sam Riley. I'm the president of the board at the Union Mills Homestead Foundation. And before we get into introductions for the rest of our panel, I'd like to do a few housekeeping items. We invite your participation this evening, and you can do so by typing in questions in the comments in whatever platform you're using to watch the program this evening. We will get in as many questions as we can before the program is over. The recording of this program will be available on our social media sites after the program is completed. I would like to introduce our executive director, Kyle Dalton at the Union Mills Homestead, and also Barry Knight, who is an expert in the tanning of leather. Barry is coming to us this evening from the United Kingdom. So Barry, thank you so much for staying up late for us. We met Barry through actually a YouTube video that we found online, and we'll be showing you that video later on this evening. So without further ado, here are Kyle and Barry. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Sam. And thanks for joining us tonight, Barry. Now, I'd like to start off by asking you to tell us a little bit about yourself. Just give us a general introduction of who Barry Knight is.
Oh, wow. I left school in 1981 with no formal qualifications. I found myself working in a tannery. I knew nothing about leather before I started. After a few years, I got interested in the history and the science behind leather making, which led me on to study leather technology. And that was first line through to like an advanced level, which took about 4 years. During that time, I was driving taxis at night, working in the tannery through the day. And after that, I went on to study environmental science and so on. And then I quickly rose through the ranks, becoming a technician. And then I went into sales, became sales director. And finished off as chief executive. In 2014, I was elected president of the United Leather Federation, and around about the same time, I was awarded a fellowship to the Society of Leather Technologists and Chemists. So you might say that I worked my way up to the pits, but it actually took me a long time to get to the pits. So recently, I've worked for a company in Bristol called Thomas Ware & Son. I worked for them for about 11 years or so. I took early retirement in 2021 during COVID, actually. But I'm still working with a tannery in Bristol as a technical consultant. And I've recently took up another position in Argentina, again, working as a technical consultant. So there you have it.
And now you had said something interesting there at the very beginning. In America, we don't often think of tanning or leather making as a major industry here. It, of course, is, and it's always been part of American culture, as Union Mills Homestead would attest. But most people wouldn't think of just walking into a tannery job. Were you able to just apply as though you were applying for any other job? Is it a major industry and part of the culture in the UK, or is it also kind of niche over there?
Kyle, that's a very good question. You know, the tanning industry in the UK was the second largest industry for many centuries. Unfortunately, it's nothing but a cottage industry now. There's probably 20 tanneries surviving. Still employs, maybe 20,000 people. that's it, the entire leather trade. America had a huge industry. Places like Peabody or Peabody in Massachusetts, Gloversville in New York, and places like Milwaukee, Pennsylvania, huge tanneries. I mean, there would number thousands. Again, due to high cost of labor, environmental issues, etc., most of this has been driven abroad. The tanning industry is huge. I was once informed it generates something like 3 times the amount of rubber, cotton, tea, coffee, and sugar, and that's combined. So it's very much a huge industry, but most of that's now carried out in China, India, places where labor tends to be cheaper.
So as a smaller industry, when you got into it, what did it look like when you went to look for a job there? What drew you to it as a young man?
I basically needed a job, plain and simple, because I left school with no formal qualification. The only avenues open to me was manual work. So it was literally a place that paid a good wage. That's initially what attracted me to tanning.
And then you eventually got interested into in the history of tanning, historical tanning, where it came from and where we're going. I think maybe a good introduction to this would be the short video that Sam mentioned. Would you like to give us a little introduction to the video before we play?
Yeah, well, this video was shot as a soft promotional marketing tool. The guy who actually shot the video has become a close friend. He actually does a lot of work for the BBC. He shoots a lot of natural history programs. He's actually the cameraman. So we came to the tannery with a script, which is not really it's not my speciality, reading from scripts. So I basically walked the guy around the place and introduced him to how we make the leather and so on and so forth. And he said, okay, he mic'd me up, and we spent a few hours just talking about leather, and actually sort of taking some footage. And he put together what I consider a beautiful short film.
Great. Well, thank you so much. And Ian, I think we can go ahead and roll it.
I often stand and glance outside the gates and look at people at peak hour traffic. They're looking into the entrance of the tannery. There's very little to be seen from their window, and I often wonder what people think of the place. And I don't believe they would have a clue what goes on inside the gates. If you go to some of the larger tanneries around the world, it's very much automated, and hardly a human actually touches the leather itself as it comes through. But it's often been said, if a tanner came back from 500 years ago, it would recognize all of the aspects of our leather making today. We sell our leather based on tradition, on provenance, and there's a lot of emphasis on the craft as well. Pretty much all of the work is done by hand. We actually start the process off with the raw hide itself. We remove the hair, we lime the hide, which actually opens up the fibre structure. We set out to make a bespoke leather. So we impart oils, waxes, greases to give the exact characteristics demanded by the customer. There's a great demand for traditional leather. We've gone back to our roots, we've dusted off the old recipe books. And we've started to recreate this leather over the last 4 or 5 years. We tan the leather very slowly over a period of time with vegetable matter. The bark is stripped off the branches. It's fed through a machine that grinds the bark down into a dust. We make a tea out of that dust. And we lay the hide in the pits for 1 year and 1 day. This goes back to a guild that was established in the medieval period. Sometimes straight off the shelf, they all look the same. And it's only in a few years' time when the person who's actually bought the saddle or the shoes recognised the quality. The very best leather is made by people who actually understand the craft and the chemistry. In the nature of my work as a tanner, I engage with a lot of craftspeople. There's the clog makers, saddlers, sport ball makers. Each and every craft is fascinating. Our leather goes to every point of the compass. America, Europe, Japan. There's a demand for traditional quality leathers. The leather industry, as it stands, is as strong as it's been for the last 20 years. Having said that, we've gone from many thousands of tanneries down to a handful. The ones that survive today are pretty much the best tanners in the world.
Great. There were a few things that popped up in there that I wanted to ask you about. I'm also going to remind our audience that you can leave comments and they'll be passed on to us. If you have any questions or prompted as we go along, we'll ask those as we continue. Now, first thing that I wanted to bring up was you mentioned that the best tanners know their craft and their chemistry. And you mentioned the bark that was used in there. This is something that we're very familiar with at Union Mills Homestead. The only surviving building of our tannery complex is the bark shed. And we know of advertisements from the 1870s, 1840s, calling for bark, saying they would pay for bark. What chemically does bark do for leather?
Okay, that's a good question. Without getting into very involved chemistry, basically, there's a lot of tannin that's contained in wood. That would be the leaves, the wood itself, but more so the tree bark. Regardless of whether it's oak, chestnut, or whatever type of tree, there's a high amount of tannin that's contained in the bark. So what happens is that the tanner would steep the bark in water. Or actually, I should actually take that back. The bark is actually cut from coppice trees. These are the immature branches to allow the. So this is around when ships were made out of wood. The shipbuilders wanted a very straight tree. So in order to make the tree grow straight, the woodsman would actually cut the lower branches of the tree, and these younger branches contained the highest amount of tannin. So he weren't actually cutting down the tree to make leather. The branches would be cut during the winter time when the sugars in the sap were at the lowest. So the branches would be cut and then stored for maybe 6 months or so to allow the wood to go dry, and then they would take the bark off, and then that would be stored for another period of probably 6 months or a year. The drier the better. When it goes through the bark mill, which is basically a giant grindstone that takes the bark to a dust or a fine medium. And then that I'll give you an example. It's like making tea. So rather than using bark, they will use a tea bag, which is full of tea leaves. So that's steeped in water, and the tannin comes out of the tea. And that's the same as the oak bark. So the oak bark would have been sat in water for long periods to allow the tannins to leach out. And what happens when hides or pelt is actually exposed to the tannin liquor? Very slowly over time, the tannins actually penetrate into the structure of the hide, which is essentially protein. And the tannins actually change the chemical composition of the hide. And I think one of the dictionary statements about tanning is it's hide that's been treated so it doesn't putrefy or rot. And essentially, that's what the tannin does. It prevents the leather from prevents the leather from rotting.
Right. This, I think you may have already kind of answered this, but I wanted to clarify. We did have a question from James Wilson. Thank you for tuning in, James, where he asks if black walnut trees would work for tanning. I think you said that it kind of doesn't matter the species of tree. Is that fully correct, or are there some trees that are better than others?
Absolutely, some trees are better than others, and I'm sure that walnut. I'm not familiar with black walnut, but I'm sure it would. If you had an abundance of the wood or the bark, you can actually make leather. The reason why oak barks was used certainly in the UK is there's an abundance of oak trees. That's the dominant species. Also, there's a high amount of tannin that comes from oak. It's actually between 10 and 12% of actual tannin that you can extract from oak bark, which is relatively high. Having said that, commercially these days for vegetable tan leathers, the preference would be to use Quebracho, which is a South American hardwood, which has a tannin content of about 30%, so 3 times stronger thereabouts. And also mimosa. Mimosa would come from Brazil and South America. And these days, all of these trees or species are farmed. So again, we're not cutting down trees to supply the leather industry.
And it also ties in with a source that I've got on hand here, published in our local newspaper, the Democratic Advocate, April 28th, 1870, here in Westminster. It was A.K. Shriver and Sons Tannery advertised for bark, and they specifically asked for chestnut oak and Spanish oak bark, emphasizing what you said, that oak was better. And also going back to how you said drier the better, they do specifically stipulate no bark will be received in a damp condition. Apparently, they'd had some trouble with that in the past. You also mentioned that you had some, we've made a few references now to South America, and that you have some experience in Argentina. Could you tell us a little bit about that?
I announced my retirement maybe a year or so before I retired, and the trade press picked up on that and actually did a very nice article about my career. So out of the water, I had probably 5 or 6 serious job offers to all parts of the globe, Japan, China. But a friend of mine actually introduced me to, actually, it was an Indian agent to a tannery in Argentina. And they learned of my retirement and asked if I'd be prepared to go out there and help them with some projects. And I went out there, had a week walking around the tannery, looking at the type of hides that they use, and I felt that I could actually help them. And within 1 year, we've had a great deal of success. We've turned some very low grade products, or I would say products that were destined for low grade, into very high grade and high value leathers.
That also brings us back here to Carroll County, where I know that the Shriver Tannery in 1832 did import some hides from Argentina. That same year, they also got some from Mexico. It seems like they were kind of catch as catch can. There were Spanish hides, hides from Charleston, South Carolina, Norfolk, Virginia, Washington, D.C., New York, Texas, and New Orleans, and a lot of local leathers. Does it make a difference where the hides come from? Are there some hides that are better than others? And why would that be?
Again, great question. To be quite honest with you, there's a number of factors that would dictate hide quality. One would be the breed. One would be the age of the cattle at kill. Factors like diet and climate. So, for example, in the UK, we would tend to buy hides that would come from Switzerland or southern parts of Germany, in the mountainous areas. One, it's a cold climate, so the hide's likely to have a thicker skin, and being a cold climate, there's less likelihood of insect damage, because what tends to happen when the insects start to bite the animal, one, you're going to get a blemish, but two, the animals will scratch themselves on barbed wire or on a fence post or whatever, and in doing so they scratch themselves, which leaves a mark that never goes away.
And we've got a few more audience questions now. Part of that, I think, I'm actually going to jump ahead on one of these because it kind of goes back to what you were saying, how the hide does have an effect on the finished product. Marianne Ashcraft, good friend of the museum, good friend of really all museums in this area, asks, what gives leather different colors?
Just repeat that, please, Kyle.
What gives leather different colors?
The different colors. Okay, that's a very good question again. Right. If we're talking about vegetable leather, with regards to Shriver Tannery, for example, here's two examples of leather, vegetable tan leather. So this one, it's difficult to see, I'm sure, but it's like a dark biscuit color. Okay, that's oak bark. So that's the type of leather that was used, or that was made at the Shriver Tannery. This leather is willow bark. You can see it's much darker. This was actually, whilst it's in my hand, I should actually mention this leather comes from a shipwreck from 1787. The ship was called the Santa Meta Catarina, and it was a Dutch sailing vessel or cargo vessel, carrying a cargo of willow bark tanned leather from St. Petersburg, and it was on its way to Genoa in Italy when it sunk. And then it was discovered in the 1970s, and a group of people have been diving on the wreck and fetching up leather. And you can see that it's a perfectly nice piece of leather. But the way that the method in which the leather is tanned, or the species of tree, gives the distinctive colors. Now, tanners can often bleach leather to lift the color, but essentially you will end up with, if I can just get a sample here, essentially with vegetable tan leather, you're restricted to colors like these. So they're browns and black, possibly green and red, but they're the darker colors. You wouldn't get a pastel color. You would need other types of tanning agents in order to give pale colors.
Thank you. And Kaylin Wheeler has a good question that also ties in with something you said in the video. You said that 500, if you'd brought somebody who was a tanner 500 years ago to your tannery today, they would recognize all of the methods. We know that the Shriver family's experience with tanning goes back to 1732 at least. That's well before the Homestead is founded.
Sure.
So considering this lengthy process and how long it's been around, as Kaylin Wheeler asks, how do you think the process was first discovered? How old is the industry?
Again, these are great questions from the audience. I mean, the fact is no one actually knows. The earliest evidence that we know of comes from cave paintings in Northern Europe. These paintings depict hides being tethered or stretched, possibly for drying. And those cave paintings have been dated back to the Paleolithic period. So we're talking between 10 and 60,000 years BC. That all said, when Peking man was discovered, the remains dated to 400,000 BC. We know that the climate where Peking man lived would have been far too cold for him to survive without some kind of protection. So we're talking days before any other garments. So we can deduce that he would have, Peking man would have kept himself warm with animal skins.
I did not expect to go back to 400,000 BC. That's wow.
Yeah.
It's incredible how some things can survive and what we can learn from that. And that goes to another great question from Kaylin Wheeler regarding the object you showed us from the underwater excavation. How was that preserved? Is leather not affected by salt water? Was there low oxygen content down there? How did leather survive that long under the water?
In this particular instance, I believe it was the shipwreck was actually laid in silt, and where there's no oxygen, it's the oxygen that basically breaks down. Well, but the oxygen then will propagate bacteria, which actually then starts to break down the leather and most natural materials. So where there's no oxygen, it's very difficult. Salt water, yes, it does have an effect, but you can wash the salt water away. Quite literally, this particular item was brought to the surface, was washed to free it with a sort of salt water, and then we simply applied oils into the leather to make it supple again. This leather, actually, smelling it, it still smells of birch tar, which was used to soften the leather as a lubricant, but also birch tar oil is a very good antiseptic. So the leather doesn't suffer from mold or other issues regarding rotting, etc.
I'm a big fan of maritime history myself, and I have a maritime history background. And it does remind me of the General Carleton of Whitby, which went down off, I think, Poland. And when she hit the bottom, her cargo, which was tar, the barrels burst and covered everything, and survived. And amazing finds come from that. Clothes survived underwater, cloth. Pretty incredible stuff. So that certainly passes the sniff test. How did you get involved in this shipwreck, and what was the process like in your contribution?
Well, when they first started to dive in the shipwreck, they were bringing the leather to my old company, the first company that I worked for, a company called Joseph Clayton's in Chesterfield, Derbyshire. Back then, I was a young guy, a young boy working in the tannery, so I had no active involvement with the guy who was diving on the wreck. But many years later, I was in Japan, and I worked on a lot of very specialized projects over the years. And the Japanese agent was saying, we need a leather that's got a really fascinating story. He said, in order to sell at high premiums, he said, Do you know of the leather of the famous Russian leather that went down in a shipwreck? And I said, yeah, I know all about it. What can I tell you about it? And he said, is that leather? Is that something that you could possibly produce? I said, the problem is willow bark. You cannot get willow bark anymore because it's not really commercially used. That's going to be the problem to make it authentic, that is. And then not that long afterwards, this conversation, the BBC shown a video of farming, and it was showing that people were actually taking the willow, which was farmed, in order to make wicker baskets. And they were actually using very hot water to strip the bark away. And in this liquid in the water, I could actually see it had a high proportion of bark or tannin. So I quickly went down to see the farm. I collected a sample of this leather, and I was able to replicate the same kind of leather using Siberian birch oil also. And also the guy who used to dive on the wreck. Now, the wreck were closed 25 years ago because their license run out. Basically, they had a license from the Crown in order to dive on the wreck. Anyway, so I got involved with the guy who actually dived on the wreck. So I was making the leather under his not supervision, but under his guidance, should I say. And we released the leather as a exclusive run, 1,000 pieces, and it sold very well in Japan.
Fascinating. So, how is the process of making leather in the, say, 18th, 19th century different from what it becomes in the 20th century? What are the changes that bring leather to the point that it's at today?
Okay. Another great question. So the truth of the matter, there's been very little advances in, certainly when we're talking vegetable leather, as Shriver would have made, there's no advances in vegetable tanning from the Greco-Roman period, which you're probably talking 4,000 years BC, until the 1850s. In England, there was a guild that were established in about 1200 AD. And the guild basically said that leather had to be tanned for 1 year or 1 day. And that actually held back the UK leather industry, simply because we couldn't make the leather any quicker. So very little changes for probably 4,000 years thereabouts. But I would say that the main difference between what Shriver was doing back then and what the vegetable tanners are doing now, as a general rule, is Shriver would have been tanning in pits. So the hides would have been suspended underground, covered in tanning liquor, possibly containing oak bark, for many, many months, possibly up to 2 years for some of the thicker leathers. Whereas vegetable leather these days tends to be carried out in a drum. So imagine it like a giant washing machine the size of a house, and the hides are put in there, and the tanning takes place in a matter of days.
Fascinating. Question from our own Sam Riley. He wants to know about the change to chromium and other modern styles of tanning in the 1800s. What was the impact on the industry?
Well, until the Industrial Revolution, the demand for leather was pretty much constant, and the mainly artisan tanneries that was making small batches, for example. So they would be supplying the likes of saddlers, shoemakers, bootmakers, that kind of thing. But come the dawn of the Industrial Revolution, there was a huge demand for leather, where one in trains, trains used a huge amount of leather. And then you had steam-driven machinery, which all ran on a leather belt or several leather belts. So the demand was absolutely huge. And unfortunately, the tanners could not compete or could not produce the quantities that were demanded. So around about sort of 1850s thereabouts, you would have leather chemists, for want of a better word, and they was then sort of looking at new means and ways of actually producing leather. And chromium salts were being investigated. Aluminium leather that dates back 5,000 BC aluminium leather is a mineral salt, pretty much like chromium. So tanneries started to get involved in making chromium leather. It didn't really take off because it was a nasty, horrible product, causing ulcers and cancers and all kinds of things. So the base material was potassium diachromate, awful stuff. But come the 1920s thereabouts, they'd moved to chromium sulfate, which was a much kinder material to work on. And this actually revolutionized the industry. It was taking tanning times from, say, 3 months to maybe 2 years, down to a matter of weeks.
Wow.
And yeah, I should actually sort of show you a piece of chromium leather. This is chromium leather. You can see that this is a natural color. It's a very, very pale blue. And from that, you can get all kinds of vibrant colors, simply because the base color is much lighter. It also has a high affinity for dyeing, and it also has a high thermal stability. So there's lots of benefits in the chromium leather.
Interesting. What kind of dyes are used to change the color of leather like that?
It's basically the natural chrome salts that are blue. Of course, you can actually dye leather different shades. These could be natural dyes, but more often than not, they would be chemical dyes.
We do see a shift in Shriver tanning through the 19th century, a big one starting in the 1860s. 1862, Andrew Shriver's sons, A.K. Shriver's sons, Henry Wirt and Frederick Austin, take over the business. And through 1862, they're debating bringing in steam technology, some kind of big steam engine. What would that do for a tanning business? How does a steam engine help with the process?
Okay, that would fall into possibly two different categories. One, I've made a small diagram. If you could just bear with me 1 second. So I'm not sure whether you can see it or not. That is a drawing of hides that are suspended in tanning liquor. When they introduced a steam engine, that would power a rocking system, so that the leather would be continually agitated like this. They call them rocker pits, and basically that actually increases the speed, and also prevents kiss marks, because if the leather touches each other during the process, it stains and you get marks. But when the leather's been rocked like this, you don't get that. Also, with the introduction of steam, the steam engines, that would be driving these drums that I talked about. Again, these would be run on a line shaft, and the line shaft would drive belts that which in turn would drive the drums, or should I say, turn the drums. And if you tan the leather in these drums where they constant rotation like this, you can tan the leather in a matter of days.
Fascinating.
Yeah. And so what I should have said is you can actually treble your capacity.
That certainly seems to have worked out for A.K. Shriver and Sons. There was a big cattle boom following the American Civil War out of Texas, and increasingly they were getting their hides from Texas and able to produce them in pretty high quality. In 1877, they were awarded at the Philadelphia exhibition. Here I'm reading directly from the report on awards for high skill and workmanship and thoroughness in manufacture, and notable for fine finish and close trim. This is oak sole leather from Texas hides is what they were awarded for. This really did put them on the map, not only in a metaphorical sense, but literally. The Shriver Tannery was featured prominently in the 1877 Atlas of Carroll County, Maryland. This became a pretty big deal for the neighborhood. And that leads to another question from Marianne Ashcraft. Again, thank you for asking. With the tanneries located in towns here in Carroll County and really all over the United States, were people so accustomed to living in a smelly environment that they didn't mind living next to a tannery? Or I think the implication here too is, were people kind of upset by that? And how bad was the smell?
Right. Okay. Well, I can't talk about Carroll County, but I mentioned there were some guilds that were established in the 1200s in the UK. One of the rules that the guilds enforced was that tanneries had to be built downwind and downstream from towns and cities. And the reason, and another rule that was imposed, that the tanneries had to clear their sites of appendages. Now, appendages were the trimmings from the raw hide. So they had to trim they had to clear their yard once per year. So if you can imagine the smell of rotting hide trimmings that's been built up over a year, that must be pretty awful. And downstream, tanneries at the time would peg out the raw hides in the rivers because they use copious amounts of water to wash possibly salt from the hide and blood and other interfibrillary proteins that's contained in skin. So if you've got 50 hides, soaking in a stream, it wouldn't be very pleasant for the person downstream. So it must have been horrendous.
I can only imagine.
Yes. I also should point out as well, one or two key ingredients during those times would have been urine and dog feces. So a dog is a carnivorous animal, as we all know, and meat or muscle is bound together with a protein called elastin. Now, elastin forms a large part of the structure of the skin. So in order to get the elastin is elastic, as it probably suggests. So the hides would never lay flat, or the leather was difficult to become supple, whilst it had the elastin protein within the hide. And we don't know how it happened and when it happened, but they were using dog dirt or dog poo on the hides to get rid of the enzyme protein. And until 1950s, they were still using dog dirt in the tannery that I used to work for. And one of the guys I was apprenticed to, he used to handle dog dirt on a daily basis, and seemingly it would come in container ships from Turkey. Who would have thought it? Who would have thought it? He also told me it stops you from biting his fingernails.
Oh. I think this also leads into another good question from our own Sam Riley. In some of the letters and diaries of the Shrivers, there's reference to using or increasing or changing the strengths of tanning liquors. What would have done that? What would that mix look like?
Right. Okay. Again, that's a very good question. If you start the process of tanning with fresh tanning liquor, a bark liquor, that would actually slow down and be very detrimental to the final product. Why? The tan is so reactive, all it wants to do is fix on the outside of the skin. So the idea was you would use a spent liquor or an old liquor that had very little tannin content. You would start the process using that and slowly build up the tan strength as you go along. So it's a countercurrent system, pretty much. So the hides go one way, and the tannin liquors would get stronger. So you start off with the weakest, and you finish with the strongest.
Great. Another question from the audience. James Markle mentions that Renfrew Farm Museum in Waynesboro, Pennsylvania was founded by a tanner, Daniel Royer, around 1800, so around the same time that Union Mills was founded. He had a limestone furnace to burn stone for calcium carbonate, which he ground in a mill. What role does calcium carbonate play in tanning?
I would imagine that calcium carbonate, basically chalk, is used for conditioning the skin. So in preparation for dyeing. So the pH of of vegetable tan leather when it comes out of pits is around about 3.5, which is quite acidic. Most of the dye stuffs need a pH of around about 6 or 7 in order for it to penetrate the structure of the hide. So calcium carbonate is a mild alkaline. So by using the calcium carbonate, it actually brings the pH up in the structure of the hide to allow the dye penetration. I would also imagine that they would be using calcium hydroxide, and calcium hydroxide is lime, and lime is used for in the very early stages loosening the hair, and it opens up the fiber structure, and this allows the tanning to take place at a later stage.
We got another good question from Sam Riley that I'm actually interested in as well for totally different reasons. He wants to know how hides were transported from Texas to the East Coast. I'll extend that even further. We know 2 years before the mast by Richard Henry Dana, he talks about sailing to California from Massachusetts in the 1840s, going all the way around Cape Horn to pick up hides to bring back. Are these hides dried? How are they stored, and how are they prepared for such a long journey?
I would imagine during that time they would have been wet salted. Basically, the abattoir removes the hide, and the hides chilled, probably put onto a concrete floor or onto a steel plate or something. This is in order to bring the temperature down, because as soon as the animal dies, bacteria is propagating, and the first bacteria is actually sat in the hair root. So they try and chill the skin as quickly as possible. Certainly these days they do, and then they steep the hide in salt. That's just common salt. What the salt does, the salt will actually draw out the moisture that's contained in the skin, and where there's no moisture, it's more difficult for bacteria to propagate. And I think under normal conditions, a wet salted hide, would possibly last for maybe 5 or 6 months before you saw serious decay. It may be, if they're shipping in long journeys, it might be that they dried the hide. So basically they salt the hide, as I've described before, and then they would dry them in ambient conditions just to take some of the moisture out. and obviously it's lighter to transport.
Excellent. And Sam also wanted to share an anecdote from our own Louis Shriver. Louis E. Shriver is one of our best documentarians of the 19th century. Born in 1851, he witnesses the Gettysburg Address and dies in 1944. And for most of his life, he's recording things almost every day. This diary entry comes from April 1st, 1873. We had plenty of strange visitors at the tan yard today. A good many of them held their noses shut on account of the bad smell. Delicate people! Exclamation point. I think this leads into a question about tannery culture. What is the day-to-day life like for a tanner? What is the day-to-day person like who engages in leather making?
I'd certainly say it's not for the faint-hearted. Just going back to showing people around. Throughout my career, I've given countless guided tours, from school children through to historical societies, and I always start my talk off by saying, and it's not meant to be in any way abrupt or vulgar, but I always say to the people, if you're prepared to look past the shit and the smell, the next hour of the tour is going to be fascinating. If you're not prepared to look past the shit and the smell, the next hour is going to be goddamn awful. And that basically encapsulates walking through a tannery. Now, that said, I can't remember hardly a single person who would actually, at the end of the talk or the tour, turn around and say, that wasn't fascinating, or I mean, it's incredible what we do. We take a raw material that most people wouldn't touch or go within 10 feet of. Why? Because it's full of dirt, it's full of blood, it can be quite smelly, but we take that article and make some wonderful end materials. Sometimes it's beautiful, and sometimes it has amazing physical properties. It's amazing. There's not another industry like it. As I mentioned, not for the faint-hearted. The guys typically would be male. That said, in Bristol, we do employ some females, but there's no getting away from the fact, and certainly vegetable leather is very labor intensive. You've got to be physically strong. So you've got to be, strong in the head. You've got to be strong in the arm. Some people will last a few hours, but usually if they've survived the week, you've got someone who's likely to stay for many, many years. And I would say that most of the people that we employ in the tanning industry, they don't turn up every day just for their salary, because it doesn't pay that well. There's something else, that I've always thought it would possibly like being in the armed services, where there's a connection. You're doing a very, very difficult job that 90% of people wouldn't want to do, but the ones that do it sort of kind of stick together. The camaraderie is second to none, in my opinion. And I would also say that goes for all the tanneries that I've worked for, including Argentina. It's exactly the same type of people with the same sort of skill sets.
Thank you. And with that, I know we're nearing the end of our time here. I want to be respectful of your time. I know it's very late over there. But did you have any final thoughts for our audience before we say our thank yous and goodbyes?
Well, I was thinking over. I was trying to think of unique things and different types of leather that I've made in my career, and my mind was sort of drawn to a leather that was first made in pre-dynastic Egyptian times. It's alum leather, it's a white leather. So it's pure white leather. And I don't know, maybe 30 years ago, my boss came to me and said, Barry, he says, we're losing business in the equestrian trade. Try and come up with a leather that's a world beater. It cannot stretch, it cannot break, it needs to be super strong. So I put my thinking cap on. Now, rawhide or parchment, like a dog shoe, like this. This is raw skin that's been dried out. That's the strongest material. As soon as you start to tan it, it becomes weaker. But if you can control that, you can do all kinds of things. So anyway, I put my thinking cap on and did some trials, and I came up with a leather using aluminium tan, and I combined it with the parchment. So I partially tanned the leather using alum. The leather finished up something like this. I'm not sure, but is it whether you can actually see? Can you see actually a white streak in the middle?
Yeah, we can see that pretty well, actually.
Okay, so this made a leather that's indestructible. You can't break it. It won't stretch. It's just perfectly suited for that application. It became the company's biggest seller and probably still is today. And it's very much sought after. So as a young man, the boy had done well. It opened many doors for me, and I'm thinking, it's very humbling to think. Oh, sorry, and then I should say that many years later, I was researching for a talk, I think, and I found that Howard Carter, the famous Egyptologist, he went into the sarcophagus of Tutankhamun, I think 1922, and found aluminium rawhide or alum rawhide on the carriage wheels of the king, and the leather was still in good shape. That's after 4,000 years. So you start to think, it's very humbling to think that someone 4,000 years ago has used exactly the same thought process, how to make a strong piece of leather. And again, I don't believe there's another trade that you can actually sort of, put it into the pigeonhole. It's so unusual. Yeah.
Thank you for sharing all that with us. This has been a great presentation. We're already seeing some great comments in there thanking you for joining us for so late and from so far away. And I also want to thank Carroll County Public Libraries for not only hosting but producing this program and helping us to distribute it. I want to thank Celebrating America and all of our partners there. And I want to remind all of our visitors that this will be available online. Be sure to share it with your friends. Let people know. I didn't get to all your questions. I'm sorry. But I'm glad that we had such an engaged audience tonight. Please consider supporting your local library and supporting your local museums. And again, thank you everybody for joining us tonight. And thank you especially, Barry, for sharing with us your personal experience, your expertise. This program is literally impossible without you. So thank you so much.
You're very welcome. Thank you.
And good night, everyone. Thank you for joining us. And please tell your friends.
Okay. Goodbye. Bye-bye.